Nobody planned for Margaret Elise Dowe to survive the fall. Not the paramedics who arrived at the bottom of the staircase and found her unconscious, with a pulse that kept stuttering like a candle in wind. Not the emergency room doctor who spent 40 minutes stabilizing her before anyone felt confident enough to use the word stable without a qualifier attached to it. Not her 3 children, who arrived at the hospital in separate cars within the same hour and stood in a corridor outside the trauma unit, looking shaken in the way that people look when something has happened faster than they were ready for. And certainly not Margaret herself, who had simply been walking downstairs in her own home at 7 in the evening with a cup of tea in her hand and had caught her foot on the lip of the 3rd step from the bottom, the one she had been meaning to fix for 2 years and had kept putting off because there was always something more pressing. The cup had gone first, then her footing, then everything else. She was 71 years old. She had lived in the house on Grayfield Road for 38 years. She had raised 3 children in that house, buried a husband from it, paid off the mortgage on it 17 years ago with the last of an insurance payout that she had managed with the careful precision of a woman who understood that financial mistakes at her income level were not recoverable. The house was hers, fully and without debt, and it was the thing she had always considered the foundation of whatever security her life contained. The fall happened on a Thursday evening in October. By the following Monday, her children had begun making phone calls. Not about her recovery, which was progressing slowly, but in the right direction according to the neurologist, who visited each morning with a clipboard, and a cautious optimism that Margaret was learning to read accurately. The calls her children were making were to a different category of person entirely: a property solicitor, a financial advisor, a locksmith, though that particular call would not happen for another week. Margaret did not know about any of this yet. She was in a hospital bed with a fractured hip, 2 cracked ribs, a mild concussion that made bright light uncomfortable, and a level of physical dependency that she found more distressing than the pain itself. She was not a woman who had ever been easy with needing help. She had managed things herself for so long that the simple act of asking a nurse to adjust her pillow required a conscious override of something deep and stubborn in her character. Her eldest, Phillip, visited on the Tuesday. He sat in the chair beside her bed with the particular posture of a man who is prepared for a conversation and is waiting for the appropriate moment to begin it. He was 51 years old, worked in financial services, and had inherited from somewhere, not from Margaret, a relationship with money that was transactional in a way that occasionally made her uncomfortable. He asked how she was feeling. She told him. He nodded and looked at his hands for a moment, and then said that he and his sisters had been talking, and that they wanted to make sure everything was managed properly while she was recovering, and that it would be helpful if she would sign a temporary power of attorney so that they could handle things on her behalf. Margaret looked at him. She asked what things specifically needed handling. Phillip said the house primarily, and the car, which was sitting unused on the driveway, and her accounts, which needed someone to manage the bills and direct debits while she was unable to do so herself. Margaret said she would think about it. Phillip said that the longer they waited, the more complicated things became, and that really it was just a practical matter. Margaret said she understood, and that she would think about it. He left the folder of documents on her bedside table when he went. She did not open it that evening. She lay in the dimmed room after visiting hours ended and looked at the ceiling and thought about 3 things simultaneously. The first was whether she trusted her own children with the legal authority to make decisions about her assets. The second was whether the fact that she was genuinely uncertain about the answer to that question said something important that she should have paid attention to earlier. The third was something she had not thought about in several months, but that surfaced now with a quiet insistence that she recognized as significant. The farm. Not her house, not the car on the driveway or the accounts with their bills and direct debits. The farm. 46 acres of land and a collection of aging outbuildings sitting in a valley 2 hours east of the city, left to Margaret alone by her mother Vera 11 years ago, when Vera had passed at the age of 89, with her mind completely intact, and her affairs in the kind of order that reflected a lifetime of paying attention. Vera had bought the farm in her 60s with money she had saved over 40 years of work and careful living. She had not farmed it herself in any serious commercial sense. She had leased the fields to neighboring farmers, maintained the outbuildings in a state of basic preservation, and visited every summer for 2 weeks to walk the land and sit on the porch of the old farmhouse and read. She had loved it with the quiet, unglamorous devotion of someone who had grown up with very little and understood what it meant to own something rooted in actual earth. When she died, she had left it to Margaret, and Margaret alone. Not to all 3 of her grandchildren. Not divided between Margaret and her late brother. To Margaret specifically, with a handwritten note in the envelope with the will that said simply, "You will know what to do with it when the time comes." Margaret had not known what to do with it. She had continued the leasing arrangements her mother had established, collecting a modest annual income from the 2 farming families who worked the fields, and visiting occasionally when the pull of the place became strong enough to act on. She had not thought about it as an asset in any strategic sense. She had thought about it the way her mother had, as a place, as something with its own particular quality of permanence in a world where very little was actually permanent. Her children had been to the farm exactly once, a day trip 8 years ago that Phillip had found boring, her middle daughter Karen had found muddy, and her youngest, Simone, had genuinely seemed to enjoy before falling asleep in the car on the way home. None of them had mentioned it since. None of them had asked about it in years. It was not in the power of attorney documents Phillip had left on her bedside table. Whether that was an oversight or a calculation, Margaret could not yet say. But she noticed it. She noticed it the way she noticed most important things, quietly and without immediately revealing that she had. She reached out and moved the folder to the drawer of the bedside table without opening it. Then she turned off the light and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ward and thought about 46 acres of land sitting in a valley 2 hours east, patient and unhurried, exactly as her mother had left it. The power of attorney was signed on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Margaret's fall. She had not wanted to sign it. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, because clarity about what she actually wanted had become something she was holding on to, carefully, in a situation that kept presenting her with reasons to let it go. She had not wanted to sign it, but she had been in a hospital bed for 3 weeks with a fractured hip that was healing at the pace these things healed at, regardless of how impatient she was, and the bills at home were real, and the car insurance renewal was due, and the direct debits needed managing. And when she had asked the ward social worker about alternatives, the conversation had been long and complicated, and had ultimately suggested that a family power of attorney was the most straightforward solution available to her. Straightforward. That was the word that had finally moved her. She was tired. She was in pain that had reduced but not disappeared. She was spending her days in a bed in a room with 3 other women, one of whom snored with a dedication that Margaret had come to find almost admirable. She wanted to go home. She wanted to sleep in her own bed and make her own tea and sit in her own garden for whatever the autumn had left to offer. She did not have the reserves, physical or emotional, for a prolonged legal alternative to the straightforward solution sitting in front of her. She signed the documents. Phillip witnessed them with his fountain pen and a composed expression. Karen sat in the corner of the room and smiled at Margaret in a way that was warm, but did not quite reach her eyes. Simone had not come. She had sent a message saying she was sorry she couldn't be there, and that she was thinking of Margaret, and that she hoped she felt better soon. Margaret had read the message twice, and put her phone face down on the blanket. What she had not signed, and what nobody in that room asked her about, was anything relating to the farm. The power of attorney covered the house on Grayfield Road, the vehicle, and the personal bank accounts. It did not extend to the farm, which was held separately under the terms of her mother's estate, and which would have required a different and more specific legal instrument to include. Nobody mentioned this. Not Phillip, not Karen, not the solicitor who had prepared the documents, and who had presumably read the full extent of Margaret's assets during the preparation process. Margaret did not mention it either. She simply noted the absence and added it to the list of things she was keeping careful track of from her hospital bed. What happened in the following 2 weeks arrived not as a single event, but as a series of small steps that were each individually explainable and collectively revealed something Margaret had been hoping she was wrong about. First, the locksmith. Karen called her on a Tuesday to say that she had arranged for the locks on Grayfield Road to be changed for security reasons, since the house had been unoccupied for nearly a month and the neighborhood had apparently had some incidents. Margaret said she understood and asked Karen to bring her a key. Karen said of course, and then did not bring one for 5 days, at which point she arrived at the hospital with a key on a plain ring and set it on the bedside table and moved immediately to other topics before Margaret could examine it or ask questions. Second, the car. Phillip mentioned in a phone call that he had moved it to his own driveway because the parking on Grayfield Road required a resident permit and the permit had expired and he did not want Margaret to come home to a parking fine. Margaret said that was thoughtful and wrote the detail down in the small notebook she had started keeping under her pillow. Third, and this one arrived not through her children, but through a phone call from her bank, a branch manager named Helen, who had dealt with Margaret's accounts for several years, and who called, with careful professional tact, to let her know that a significant transfer had been processed under the power of attorney, and that the bank simply wanted to confirm Margaret was aware of it. The transfer was to an account Margaret did not recognize. The amount was not small. Margaret thanked Helen and said she was aware of it, because she had learned very quickly that information arrived faster when you did not immediately reveal alarm. And then she put the phone down and sat very still for a moment, with her hands flat on the blanket. She thought about the house, the car, the accounts. Then she thought about the farm. She asked the ward nurse if she could use the ward telephone for a private call. The nurse said she could use the phone in the family room at the end of the corridor, if it was free. Margaret put on her dressing gown, took her cane, and walked the length of the corridor at the pace her hip currently permitted, which was slow but steady and improving daily. She sat down in the family room, which was empty, and dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a man answered with a careful, professional greeting. His name was Robert Ashe. He was a solicitor who had handled her mother's estate 11 years ago, and who had subsequently helped Margaret update her own will twice, most recently 3 years ago. He was thorough, discreet, and had the kind of steady telephone manner that inspired confidence without requiring performance. Margaret told him what had happened, not quickly, in the organized, sequential way she had always communicated important information, starting from the fall and moving forward through each development in the order it had occurred. She did not editorialize. She did not describe how she felt about any of it. She presented the facts and let them speak at their own volume. Robert listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a brief silence of the kind that means a person is thinking rather than hesitating. Then he said that there were several things he needed to check before he could give her a clear picture, but that based on what she had described, the power of attorney as she had signed it did not extend to the farm, and that the farm therefore remained entirely outside whatever had been done or was being done with her other assets. Margaret said she had thought that was the case, but wanted to confirm it. Robert said he would confirm it formally and have documentation prepared. He also said, with the careful precision of a man who understood the difference between what he knew and what he suspected, that it might be worth her moving relatively quickly on certain things. Margaret asked him what things specifically. He told her. She wrote each item in her notebook, in the small, careful handwriting she had used her entire life for things that mattered. Then she thanked him, said she would call again tomorrow, and walked back down the corridor to her bed at the same slow and improving pace, her cane tapping steadily on the linoleum, her face giving nothing away to the nurses who nodded at her as she passed. She had 46 acres of land and a farmhouse in a valley 2 hours east. Her children had apparently forgotten it existed. She was beginning to understand that this might be the most important thing that had happened to her since she fell down those stairs. Robert Ashe arrived at the hospital on a Thursday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and the composed expression of a man who had seen complicated family situations before and had learned to navigate them without taking sides or losing his footing. He sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed and opened the briefcase on his knee and spent the first 10 minutes going through what he had confirmed in the 3 days since her phone call. The power of attorney covered precisely what had been stated in the document: the house on Grayfield Road, the vehicle registered in her name, and the 2 personal bank accounts listed in the schedule. It did not, in any legal reading of the document, extend to any other asset. The farm, held under the terms of her mother Vera's estate and transferred to Margaret's sole ownership 11 years ago, was a separate legal entity entirely. It had its own title deeds, its own registered ownership, and its own financial arrangements in the form of the lease agreements with the 2 farming families. None of this had been included in the power of attorney. None of it could be touched by anyone acting under that document. Margaret nodded at each point as Robert confirmed it. She had expected this, but there was a difference between expecting something and having a solicitor sit beside you and confirm it in writing, and that difference was the solid ground she needed under her feet before she could take the next step. She asked Robert about the bank transfer. He said he had looked into it, and that it appeared to be within the technical scope of the power of attorney as written, which meant that reversing it would be difficult but not impossible, and would depend on whether the transfer could be shown to fall outside the spirit of the document, even if it sat within the letter of it. He recommended a separate conversation with a specialist if she wished to pursue that avenue. Margaret said she would think about it. She wrote something in her notebook and looked at it for a moment. Then she asked Robert about the farm specifically, not about its legal status, which was now confirmed, about its current condition, about the lease arrangements, about whether anything had happened there in the past month that she should be aware of. Robert said he had made a call to one of the leasing families, a man named David Howell, who had farmed the eastern fields for 9 years. David had confirmed that everything was operating as normal. The lease payments were up to date. The fields were being worked according to the seasonal schedule, and nobody had contacted him on Margaret's behalf or made any inquiries about the arrangement. Nobody had called about the farm at all. Margaret absorbed this quietly. She then told Robert about the second thing she had asked him to look into during their initial phone call. The thing she had not mentioned to her children, or to the ward nurse, or to Donna, who had visited twice and brought soup and sat with Margaret for long, careful hours, that Margaret appreciated more than she had expressed. 3 years ago, during the most recent update to her will, Robert had mentioned something in passing that Margaret had filed away at the time, without fully acting on. He had noted that the land the farm sat on had certain characteristics, based on the title deeds and the original survey, that might make it worth having properly assessed by a specialist. He had not pressed the point. She had not followed up on it. Life had continued, and the farm had remained what it had always been to her, a place rather than an asset. Her mother's land, the valley, and the outbuildings, and the old farmhouse with the porch where Vera had sat and read in the summers. She asked Robert now whether that assessment had ever been done. He said it had not. She asked him to arrange it. He made a note and said he would have someone out within the fortnight. He asked if she had a particular reason for the timing. Margaret looked out the window of the ward for a moment. The view was a car park, and beyond it, a section of roof and a pale sky. Not much to look at. She looked at it anyway. She said that she had been lying in a hospital bed for nearly a month while her house was emptied of its contents. Her car was removed from her driveway, and a significant amount of money was transferred out of her account. She said that she was not a person who had ever operated from a position of anger, and that she did not intend to start now, but that she had decided it was time to understand fully and precisely what she actually had. Robert said that was a very reasonable position. She said she also had a question for him that was not strictly legal in nature. She said she wanted to know his honest opinion, as someone who had handled her affairs for over a decade and who had known her mother's estate before he had known hers, about whether the farm was likely to be worth more or less than it had been when her mother bought it. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said that rural land values in that region had moved considerably over the past decade. That certain types of land, particularly land with the characteristics he had noted 3 years ago, had attracted a significant level of interest from both agricultural and commercial buyers. That he could not give her a figure without the specialist assessment, but that his honest opinion, offered carefully and without specific numbers, was that what she owned in that valley was probably worth considerably more than either of them had been thinking about it. Margaret thanked him. She closed her notebook. She asked one final question. She asked whether there was anything her children could do, under the existing power of attorney or through any other legal mechanism available to them, to access or sell or transfer the farm without her direct knowledge and consent. Robert said no, clearly, firmly, and without qualification. Margaret nodded. After he left, she sat in the quiet of the ward for a long time. The woman in the opposite bed was asleep. Somewhere down the corridor, a trolley rattled past. The pale sky outside the window had shifted to a darker gray that suggested rain was coming. She thought about her mother, about Vera, who had grown up with nothing and built something real from nothing, and had understood, with the bone-deep wisdom of a woman who had never had the luxury of being careless, that the things most worth protecting were the things nobody else had thought to want yet. She thought about a valley 2 hours east, about fields being worked by a man named David Howell, who had not received a single phone call in the past month, about an old farmhouse with a porch and a survey that had never been properly completed, and a specialist who would be visiting within the fortnight. She thought about her children, who had moved quickly and efficiently through the assets they knew about, without once thinking to ask her about the ones they didn't. And she thought about a handwritten note in an envelope, 11 years old, in her mother's careful script. "You will know what to do with it when the time comes." She reached for her notebook and opened it to a fresh page. She was beginning to understand that the time had come. The specialist arrived at the farm on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November. Margaret was not there in person. Her hip would not permit the 2-hour drive yet, and even if it had, she had decided it was better to remain at the hospital for the time being and let events develop at their own pace without her presence announcing that something significant was in motion. She had learned over the past month that invisibility had its uses. Her children had moved so quickly and so confidently through her assets precisely because they had assumed she was too unwell to pay close attention. She saw no reason to correct that assumption before she was ready. The specialist's name was Frances Gould. She was a land surveyor and environmental assessor with 30 years of experience and a particular expertise in rural land evaluation. Robert had used her twice before on other matters and trusted her work completely. She spent 2 full days at the farm with her equipment and her notebooks, walking every section of the 46 acres, taking samples, examining the water sources, reviewing the geological survey data that Robert had pulled from the original title documentation, and spending considerable time in the fields that the leasing farmers had been working for years. She called Robert on the Thursday evening and spoke to him for 40 minutes. Robert called Margaret the following morning. He said he wanted to come in person rather than discuss it on the telephone. Margaret said she understood and asked him to come that afternoon. He arrived at 2 o'clock with his briefcase and Frances Gould's preliminary report, which was 14 pages long and contained several figures that he placed in front of Margaret carefully, and with the considered manner of a man delivering information he wanted her to have time to absorb properly. She read the executive summary first, then she read it again. Then she sat back against her pillows and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The farm's 46 acres sat above what Frances Gould's assessment identified as a substantial underground water reserve, a natural aquifer that had been forming over centuries and that fed a network of springs across the wider valley. The presence of this reserve had implications that extended across several categories. Agricultural value, which was already established through the leasing arrangements. Commercial development potential, which Frances had assessed as significant given recent infrastructure changes in the region. And a third category that Margaret had not anticipated: environmental and conservation designation, because the aquifer and its associated ecosystem qualified the land for a specific protected status that, if pursued, would both restrict certain types of development and attract a category of funding and investment that rural landowners rarely accessed. The valuation Francis had produced was not a single number. It was a range, depending on which path Margaret chose to pursue. The bottom of the range was substantially more than the farm had ever been appraised at. The top of the range was a number that Margaret read twice to make sure she had understood the digits correctly. She asked Robert what her options were. He listed them in the same methodical way he always presented information. She could sell the land outright to any number of parties who would be interested, given what the assessment had found. She could develop a commercial arrangement around the water rights specifically, while retaining ownership of the land. She could pursue the conservation designation and work with the environmental bodies who funded and managed such things. She could continue exactly as she was, leasing the fields and living off the modest income, now with the knowledge of what she was sitting on. Or she could combine elements of several of these in a way that served her specific needs and intentions. Margaret said she needed time to think. Robert said she had time. The farm was not going anywhere, and nobody who was not Margaret could do anything with it. That evening, after Robert left, Simone arrived. Not Philip, not Karen. Simone, the youngest, who had not been present for the power of attorney signing, and who had sent the message Margaret had read twice and placed face down. She arrived without calling ahead, which was unusual for her, and sat in the chair beside the bed with her coat still on and her hands folded in her lap, and a look on her face that Margaret recognized as the specific expression her youngest child had always worn when she was about to say something difficult. Simone said that she had found out what Philip and Karen had been doing. Not all of it, but enough. She said she had not known the extent of it when it began, and that by the time she had understood, she had not known how to raise it without the conversation becoming something that fractured the family irreparably. She said she was sorry that she had not come sooner. She said she was sorry in the simple, direct way of someone who meant it without expecting it to fix anything. Margaret looked at her youngest child for a long moment. She said that she appreciated Simone coming and that she appreciated the honesty. She said that what happened next was not going to be about punishment or recrimination, because she was not built for those things and did not intend to start being built for them at 71. She said that there would be conversations with Philip and Karen that would be uncomfortable, and that she would need Simone to be honest in those conversations regardless of what it cost her. Simone said she would be. Margaret said good. Then she said that there was something she wanted to tell Simone, something she had not told anyone yet, and that she wanted to tell her now because she needed someone who was on her side to know. She told her about the farm, about Francis Gould and the assessment and the aquifer and the range of numbers at the bottom of a 14-page report currently in her bedside drawer. She watched Simone's expression move through surprise and disbelief and something that finally settled into a stillness that looked a great deal like the feeling Margaret had experienced reading the executive summary that morning. When she finished, Simone was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, that nobody had ever mentioned the farm. In any of the conversations, in any of the planning, nobody had brought it up once. Margaret said she knew. Simone said she did not think that was an accident. Margaret said she did not think so either. She said she thought it was something more telling than an accident. She said that when people moved quickly through what they assumed you had, without asking what you actually had, they told you something important about the difference between concern and calculation. She reached into the bedside drawer and removed her notebook. She opened it to the page where the list had been growing steadily over the past weeks, item by item, in her small, careful handwriting. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Simone. She said that she had been lying in a hospital bed for over a month, and that she had spent that time paying very careful attention and writing very careful notes and making very careful plans. She said that she was going to be discharged within the next 10 days, according to the consultant's most recent assessment. She said that when she left this hospital, she was not going to Grayfield Road, where the locks had been changed and the rooms had been emptied of things she had not authorized anyone to remove. She was going to the farm. She was going to the valley 2 hours east, where her mother had walked the land and sat on the porch and understood something that Margaret was only now fully grasping, that the most important things you own are sometimes the ones that nobody else has thought to look at yet, and that the right moment to act on what you have is not when everyone else has already seen its value. It is precisely before that, in the quiet, in the waiting, in the space between what something appears to be and what it actually is. Outside the hospital window, the November sky had gone dark early, the way it does at that time of year, dropping without warning from gray afternoon to full night. Somewhere in a valley 2 hours east, 46 acres of land sat in that same darkness, patient and unhurried, above an aquifer that had been forming for centuries and that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the person whose name was on the deed to finally understand what it meant. Margaret closed her notebook. She looked at her daughter. She said, simply, and with the complete certainty of a woman who had spent a month lying still and thinking clearly, that things were about to become very different from what anyone expected. And for the first time since she had caught her foot on the third step from the bottom on a Thursday evening in October, she felt entirely, solidly, and without question like herself.